All right, so this is going to be, or going to attempt to be, Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, subtitled A 17-Part Reading, Elaboration, and/or Interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And this will be Part 8. I'm not entirely certain what the final title might be, but provisionally, for the time being, this could be called a brief taxonomy of the varieties of narratological illusion, and it could be titled something else as well. It could be titled something like a brief history of the various muses of illusion, and illusion is really problematic here because it's it's a word that has a Latin etymology, right? And it's not a Greek word. And David points this out, at the very outset of narrating this piece. And so if we wanted Part 8 to have a title that relates to a Greek word, the obvious choices would be the Pseudologoi, the Pseudologoi, right? The lies or the deceptions, perhaps, as a figure of illusion, or perhaps something related to Dolos, the figure of Dolos, the Dolosoi, a brief history of the Dolosoi, and but both already, right? Presume and place in a certain kind of box what this relationship between illusion and deception, and the muses of illusion and the muses of deception might represent. And of course, in what David wants to point out at the very outset, using a kind of pragmatics, linguistic pragmatics, is that context frames the deployment of deception and illusion in various kinds of linguistic acts and linguistic games, just as much as context frames any other deployment of any other type of linguistic invention. And so to put deception or illusion in the camp of something that's entirely positive or entirely negative, again, is to take sides in this sort of binary construction of distinctions that might be made between the true and the false, that don't account for all of the various human and subjective ways and shades and textures by which these various rhetorical strategies are actually employed in real world acts of communication, right? So my framing it this way is imprecise and long-winded, but David conveys all of this very succinctly and concisely in his opening, and so he begins with this quotation from Hesiod, right, in the Theogony. And he compares it with something that we've seen before, right? We've seen this expression, the muses. The muses are the daughter of memory, right? The muses are the daughter of Memne, and so he begins with this line from Hesiod. The Pseudologoi are the daughters of Eris, and he says, well, maybe, but maybe not. It depends on what you're looking at, right? So, deception in storytelling, and what sometimes is blanketly and across, right, different and various pragmatic uses of deception in storytelling is referred to as lying. And we even have, and he points this out, we even have in psychology, in English, an expression, paralogia fantastica. And what that refers to, he points out, is the way that a storyteller, invents and these deceptions, and particularly when relating information regarding his or him or herself, and the function of the pseudologia fantastica is to create this myth of the storyteller, and that it betrays certain aspects of the storyteller's pathology, and his need to control information regarding his personal narrative, and in fact, as a pathological phenomenon, the individual who narrates these lies and deceptions about himself or herself or themselves comes to believe them, and these lies and deceptions come to inform the way that this individual acts and behaves in the world, right? And but he points out that this word, the daughters of Eris in this formulation from Hesiod already presupposes a lot of negative baggage that we may or may not want to sweep across the board without much care for distinction in talking about varieties of rhetorical deception and their various pragmatic and whatever lies beyond pragmatic uses and context, right? And so for example, then and how David at this particular moment knew to choose as his example Donald Trump, because this was David's story, or it's not a story, but David's discourse here, it precedes the election of Donald Trump by many years, and so how he knew to select Donald Trump as an example, I have no idea, but nevertheless, he says, well, in thinking about lies and deception, and how we understand lies and deception in storytelling, and whether or not that storytelling is narrative about narrative identification, and or about a series of fables or whatever the content might be. Think about it this way: do we really want to throw in the same box, right? A deceptive pathological liar like Donald Trump, whose stories consistently frame himself as the unlikely hero, right, of his engagement, his political and economic engagement with the world in ways that are utterly ludicrous and absurd, and that even a child could see through, right? The idiocy of the way that he formulates himself as an alazon, in contradistinction to the obvious, right, character flaws that include that include a list almost too lengthy to enumerate, but as just a partial list, right? Arrogance and violent disposition and narcissistic and characteristics of sociopathy. Whether he's a sociopath, we've already examined. And then David points actually, points again, to the future in this passage, and this this sorting, I believe that we accomplished probably around a year ago, when we sorted, Donald Trump by these categories of sorted the characteristics of Donald Trump by the categories of narcissism, sociopath, and psychopath. And it turned out that in relationship to his family members, and with those within his party that praise him and give him the proper devotion and attention, that he's merely he's across the board a narcissist, but he seems to merely be a psychopath in relationship to and exhibit psychopathic characteristics in relationship to his friends and family, and those who shower him with the appropriate adoration. But in relationship to political opponents and those he sees as other, people of color and individuals who don't belong to his particular notion of what a citizen of the United States are, then he demonstrates these characteristics of sociopathy and acts as a sociopath. So in the sorting of even in a contract and fee through Theta's sorting of Donald Trump, that we can recognize that the psychopathological characteristics that he exhibits, right, depend on the context of individuals that he's associating with. So David points out the fact that this, also suggests the importance of understanding context in examining, any, either behavioral or communicative, right, phenomenon, as it exists as a function of a relationship, right, between a perceiving subject and the communication of that perceiving subject of self-understanding and events in the world, and the relationship that he has to the audience, as well as, right, to whatever it is that's the object of that communication, right? So like two layers of context we can articulate in this in looking at this sorting of Donald Trump. Two layers of context that become important. What is the subject relationship to the object of inquiry, whether that object of inquiry is himself or something else in the world in which he exists? And then, what is the subject of inquiry's relationship with the audience that he's communicating that relationship to, right? And so these are two places in which we want to examine pragmatically, the context that determines the meaning of these communicative acts, rather than blanketly assigning a meaning to a term like deception and ignoring the fact that it varies, right, across these linguistic domains. All right, so he points that out, and then he returns to his comparison, and he says, do we really want to throw those kinds of lies and deceptions and misrepresentations of the world and all of their malignancy and their performative functions, right, to increase the attention and adulation that's paid to this monomaniacal narcissist? Do we really want to include that kind of deceptive storytelling in the same box in which we throw the devoted mother, who maybe she's a single parent and she has a job, maybe she's a cleaning lady and she works 55 to 70 hours a week, and just to support her family, and she returns home and she has a few young children, and even though that she's tired and her feet hurt, and she just really wants to go to bed, but every night before she does so, She tells a story. She tells a story to her young son or her young daughter, or maybe she has both a son and a daughter, and she spends from 30 minutes to an hour every night before they go to sleep, telling them either this fantastic fairy tale that she invents on her own, or perhaps partially remembers from memory and partially collages together from the ingredients of all these fabulous folk and wonderful fairy tales, or perhaps she collages it from partial memory of these folk and fairy tales and myths and her own experiences at work, and includes her fantasies of the future and her fantasies for her children, and does all of this so that her children not only will be entertained in those few minutes before they fall asleep, but so they'll have something to carry with them into their dreams, and their dreams of themselves for the future, and be reminded, right, of how much she loves them. Do we really want to include the deception of that kind of a storytelling in the same box? Just throw it right in the same box that we throw in the lies and deceptions of Donald Trump? Do we? Or what if she wants to tell? What if she wants to reveal to her children, but in a way that defers the revealing? And so the anagnoresis, the double not knowing, right? The anagnoresis, the not knowing, may occur for these children years later when they recall these fairy tales and realize that their mother was actually telling them about the sacrifices that she made, in her job as a maid or a cleaning lady, or something else, because maybe she had a job as something else. But the anagnoresis, mom was really talking about herself when she told these stories. And there was always a princess, or there was always, a figure like a Cinderella-like figure, because mom was Cinderella in these stories. And we only years later did we realize it, that when she was telling us the Cinderella story, she was telling us the story of her life. And this anagnoresis that occurs years later when these children grow up and they realize what the meaning of their mother's stories were, in a way, maybe it was, a partial design on the mother's part, or maybe it was unconscious. But in any case, the complexities, right? The complexities of this story and how the story grows and changes in the children's mind across time is of enormous and narrative, in the sense that I define narrative as opposite, or not opposite, but as a distinct mode, right, from this domain of story. And the narrative implications in terms of that distinction as a transformation, in the consciousness of the subject that involves desire, as opposed to, just a tale, right, is enormous. And maybe that's all built into the complexities of the narratology. So what you have is this, what seems to be a simple story on the one hand, but bears upon the devotion and the care and the relationship that this mother has established with her children in the real world, and therefore the way that it enters into the telling of the fairy tale, or the construction of the fairy tale, or the collaged fairy tale, or however it is, we have to start, we have to start imagining, this domain of the story, right, that has a future in the lives of these children as they grow up, and that become part of a much bigger way of imagining narrative identification as they reiterate these stories in memory, and maybe tell them to their own children, but see them as this unfolding of self-understanding, and so the distinction that we make in this idea of a story, a tale over here, as it's represented in a text, maybe you're talking about the Brothers Grimm. And maybe this mom, right? Maybe she does base some of her stories in the Brothers Grimm. But in the Brothers Grimm, what's not there is the way that the mom is telling the story to her children, right? And what they leave out is the external frame. That external frame where, that child that heard this story grows up, and suddenly in some moment, like maybe when mom was telling this story, she fed these children, a Madeleine, like in Proust, or maybe it wasn't a Madeleine, maybe it was some chocolate chip cookies, that she made, the night before, and placed, at the bedside while she was, narrating these stories. And maybe years later they have a chocolate chip cookie, and it reminds them of mom's chocolate chip cookie, and it takes them back to these stories, whatever they might have been. Maybe it was a Grimm's fairy tale, maybe it wasn't, maybe it was something else. But this becomes an extra-narratological frame, but it's its own story. And it has, profound narrative implications in that sense of the transformation of the psychological subject. That's not there. And if you look at the Grimm brothers' stories, as just some text on a page, right? All right. But you can see clearly that we might not want to put that mom, right, in the same box that we put Donald Trump in, right? All right, so that's obvious. So let's think about this. Let's think about this line that comes from Hesiod. The Pseudologoi are the daughters of Eris. Well, in Trump's case, yes, they are. In Trump's case, we can, certainly say that the Pseudologoi are the daughters of Eris, right? Strife. Strife, conflict, treachery, deception, all these negative things that, like, when the gods give Pandora this pithos, right? Because it's a pithos, it's not a box. They don't give her a box; they give her a jar, and it's filled with all of these things, these things that we don't want, unleashed on our world. Deception and strife and regret and pain and sorrow and suffering and cruelty. And she's curious, and so she looks into it. And maybe the Pseudologoi are in there, right? But we can think about it in a different way. We can think about it, from the perspective of this mom, working so hard to take care of her children, and then working even harder in that half an hour to an hour before they fall asleep, telling these stories. And these stories are filled with illusion and in a certain sense, right, deception, because all of what she wants to put in there, is partly collage from the Brothers Grimm or Greek mythology or some other place or some movie maybe that she remembers. But part of it is even though it's masked, is revealing a truth that they're not ready to understand yet. And the reason that it has to be masked is because they're children, and you can't tell them everything about what your experience of house cleaning was, and how maybe your boss put your hands on you in a way that was completely inappropriate. Right? You don't want to tell that to a child, but you need to tell it to someone, and maybe somewhere in your unconscious or subconscious you realize that there'll be this moment, 20, 30, 40 years later, in the story that frames the story that you're telling now, and that you anticipate, maybe just unconsciously, but they'll come to realize, like why you told this story, and all of the implications that the story had in your life and in their life, in your relationship to them, and all those types of sacrifices that you made, to sustain their lives and to sustain their minds and to help them grow, and how this also belongs to a pedagogy, to a teaching, a strategy of teaching. because you believe that, that these stories have value, right? Let's return to this idea. The Pseudologoi, are they the daughters of Eris? Maybe not. I'm not sure I entirely believe that. We saw that memory, right? Because she could. Memory could erase from remembrance the fact that it was only calliope, the fact that euterpe, erratum, polyhymnia, thalia, terpsichore, none of these muses, were actually the daughters of memory. But memory had this ability to change what people could remember. And therefore, when, she made this claim, they're all my daughters. And people would say, yeah, I remember that. When in fact, the truth of the matter was that only Calliope and Cleo were the daughters of memory, right? And it was only years later that we could come back and recover that deception from the possession of memory, and reorganize the truth, and come to understand that Melpomene and Urania and Thalia were all daughters of Melite, right? The Melitoi. And I want to propose that in part of this lost history, that Eris, Eris pulled the same kind of move that memory did in claiming, right? In claiming all of these varieties of aesthetic illusion, belong to her, and we're all her daughters. And certainly, we're gonna place Trump in that line that belongs to Eris. But I want to rescue that mom. I want to rescue that mother that's telling her children these fairy tales before they fall asleep. And, I want to rescue her. I want to take her out of that box, and I want to put it. And then here's taking her out of the box, and he's placing her, outside the box that we put her in with Trump. And don't you want to do that? And he says, don't you want to do that? Okay, so, and then he briefly, before going on, he briefly turns back and says, besides that, we already know, even from the classicists, that there's a contention. Of regarding, this one branch of deception, right? And who the parents of this branch of deception are, right? And he says, well, in Hesiod claims that Eris is the mother of the Pseudologoi, right? But if you go to Aesop and Aesop's fables, right? He says the Pseudologoi, are that they don't have parents, that they were crafted, like just like the way that Daedalus crafted the labyrinth, or crafted those wings, for his son, Icarus, which wasn't, so it turned out not to be such a good idea, and maybe even, David's being silly here, but he says, and maybe even, crafting the labyrinth wasn't such a good idea. And he says, well, it certainly wasn't such a good idea if you were one of the 7 sons or the 7 daughters that every 7 years got fed to the Minotaur. And then he laughs. So the context about whether the context about whether the labyrinth was a good idea or not, depends on whether or not, you knew one of those 7 sons and 7 daughters, or depends on what the year was, right? can go back and watch him laugh again. Or, if like Taurus, you manage to escape the island of Crete, right? Because of your divine, heritage, you managed to escape this fate, and didn't have to, worry about being fed to the Minotaur, no matter what year it was, right? So, he points out that that the context of an invention, again, determines and the way, that we think about that invention and what its use might be depends on how we evaluate it and what box we place it in, right? And so and then he returns to the story of Aesop and his version of the Pseudologoi, the lies and deceits. According to whom, they were crafted, just like Daedalus crafted the labyrinth, but they were crafted by Dolos, right? They're crafted by deception. And Dolos and the Pseudologoi are often, seen as companions. But David also points out that even Aesop, could have gotten it wrong, right? And even if the Pseudologoi, were crafted by some, mastermind of trickery and cunning and deception, you could have got it wrong. It might not have been Dolos. It could very well have been Apate, right? It could have been Apate. They crafted these lies and deceptions. So we don't know. Even here, we only have this account, and there may have been a reason that in this particular neurological slot that was available to Aesop in this particular moment of a telling, because all we have is the text. But maybe there was a boy in the audience, and he was a particularly naughty boy, and he was particularly fond of crafting these lies and deceptions, and telling them to the other students, and maybe in this narrating, Aesop wanted to call attention to this boy's habits and his way of interacting with that particular community of his peers, and he wanted to gently remonstrate and correct. He was thinking of this was kind of a didactic, we could say didactic and morally instructive moment in the narrative, and maybe Aesop knew the story from Hesiod, and maybe he also believed that the Pseudologoi were the daughters of Eris, but that's not what he said in this one moment, because he wanted to call attention to this young man and his behavior among his peers. And so he said, because the figure of Dolos was standing in for this young man, and everybody in the audience would have recognized this. Of course, it's lost to us now, but then in that context and in that moment when he said this, and maybe some of the members of the audience knew that those children that were listening to the story, they knew, because they had heard this line before, just like everybody knows this line. The muses are the daughters of memory. It doesn't matter if it's true, because everybody knows this line, right? The Pseudologoi are the daughters of Eris. Everybody knew this. And so when Aesop paused in that moment and looked hesitantly at that young man and said, of course, the Pseudologoi had no parents. And maybe he's an orphan. Maybe this young man is an orphan. The Pseudologoi had no parents, but were crafted. Were crafted by the spirit known as Dolos. In the same way that Daedalus crafted the labyrinth and also crafted those wings made from feathers and held together with wax that melted when Icarus flew too high for his own britches, right? And the kid in the audience is like, looking at him and like, are you talking about me? Right? And that's lost, and that belongs to this range of rhetorical deception and the deployment of variability in the way that that truth can be told and distorted and masked and hidden and deployed, that has all these practical functions, and that to recover it and to recover its real meaning and to recover whether it belongs in this box with Donald Trump or not, we really have to look at a lot of the intentionality and significance that lies way beyond the simple opposition of true or false, right? And has everything to do with the motivation of the storyteller and the reason that the story gets redirected, as it does in Aesop, from Eris to Dolos. And then there's still another variation, right? That Hyginus tells a completely different story and says the Pseudologoi, are the daughters of Ether and Gaia. Well, how are they? How they can't be both the daughters of Ether and Gaia and the daughters of Eris and have no father. So what's the story? Well, when Hyginus tells his story, he may have another reason for creating this domain, what I called in the last section of the piece that I narrated, that I composed, I called a domain of rhetorical deception, in which a meaning unfolds. And this is precisely what Kathy Acker did. When she talked about Herbert Marcuse as her teacher, and she opened this domain of this discursive domain of rhetorical deception, in which we could understand that Herbert Marcuse's construct of repressive desublimation was an obstacle on her road to Thebes. And what was the point of the journey? What was Thebes? What was the road to Thebes for Kathy? Well, it was, in this respect, it was an exploration of the muse of transgression. Parabassisia, right? And in order for Parabassisia, to get to Thebes, it had to, it had to take on, it had to encounter and come to terms with Herbert Marcuse, at least insofar as Herbert Marcuse represents this discourse that belongs to the construct of repressive sublimation. Because if you were to take repressive sublimation seriously, right, as the absorption of transgression back into the productive apparatus of capitalism, as a means to sustain the operations of capitalism and to expand them, right? Expand them further into the territory of human consciousness, then transgression would no longer be a possibility. Essentially, Herbert Marcuse, right, is responsible for killing the muse of transgression. He murdered the muse of transgression. And if we imagine that muse of transgression as a sphinx, you could say that it's Marcuse that performs the role of Oedipus, right? But Kathy wants to say no. She's got wings. She threw herself off the cliff. She never died, but she has to do this, as we stated, on two fronts. She has to utilize collage somehow, collogia, to redeem and to rescue parabassisia, but she also has to utilize parabassisia to redeem and to redeem, reappropriate, and reclaim collage from its commercial use. As we watched it play out in these commercial deployments, beginning with the 50s. But we see, expanded, even further today. And you can just look at anybody's YouTube channel. These very same language poets that unproblematically, promote collage and parapraxis at the phrasal and sentence level, as opposed to more, complex organizations of paratactical and hypotactical variability in the construction of complex and compound works, like all narratives are and have been, since the time of Homer and before. But promote, in certain circles, promote this oversimplified idea unproblematically, while at the same time, the videos that they put up on YouTube, are littered with these, collage-like advertisements that, effectively nullify whatever the discourse is regarding the radicality of this move, right? And the redemption and the reclamation, simply isn't there because it hasn't been engaged in relationship to context. You could say maybe there's an ironic relationship to the fact that, some of these, paratactical representations of language as an aesthetics of what isn't fetishized, right, by the culture, is completely surrounded by the fetishization of collage. And yet, soldiers on against the obvious evidence of its own environment, in the way that these fossil, fuel industries, soldier on flying in the face of the evidence of the destruction of their own environment. And the fact that, for example, here, I'll step out of, David's, argument for just a second. But for example, here, that this year, we had, in addition to, sweltering heat in the summer, our first snowfall, was well before Halloween. And this is here just a few miles outside of Gallup, New Mexico, in Arizona, in Fort Defiance, Arizona. And so the evidence before our eyes, just like the evidence before our eyes, if we look at these representations as they're placed up on YouTube or anywhere else on the internet, is this massive deployment, of collage strategy, commercialization. And yet, the discourse, soldiers on, that this is not, a commodity fetish on the part of the culture. Just like the discourse soldiers on. Oh, there's plenty of oil, left here, and there is no climate change, right? Flying in the face of the evidence. All right, so back to David's discussion, right? So he finishes up discussing how Catholic accuracy strategy has to engage these two levels, and has to encounter Herbert Marcuse, or and it wouldn't necessarily have to encounter him in the figure of a teacher or a father on the road to Thebes, but that's how she chooses to do it. And the strategy, right, plays into the way that she develops an understanding, both of collage and its relationship to narrative, and the way that various forms of rhetorical deception can be used internal to a fictive story, that one tells as a saleable object, but also external to the framing in which that object as fiction is going to be received, and that framing, the framing, the rhetorical elements that frame the object itself, can belong to, and often do belong to, the personal narratives that also occupy a relationship to these various frameworks of rhetorical deception that in any moment can open up into a domain of discourse, a discursive domain of rhetorical deception, as was the case with Aesop's telling of the story of the retelling, right? Reframing and retelling of the story of the Pseudologoi. And so with those ideas, let's begin there, he says. Let's begin there and go back and see if we can reconstitute, the history of some of the various, right, contexts in which modes of perception, modes of deception, might have emerged. And they can help us clarify distinctions, like the distinction between Donald Trump and that mom telling these stories to her children, right? Maybe in this history. So let's see if we can do that. So he begins this part of what is the seventh section of his talk, Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. He says, okay, so let's let's go back and imagine at some point in the history of poetry, maybe the distinction between a fictive imaginary and a material real, just simply wasn't there. It's hard to imagine now, he says. But maybe the reality of the story, was so well integrated as ritual into the reality, from which it grew, but toward which it was growing, back, right? Like branches, or a seed, maybe the world was the seed, from which the narrating and the telling and the poeticizing, emerged. But it returned to that world in a way that it's not bound, to return today. And in a way, when you tell a story or a fiction, you don't have characters like Icarus in Raymond Queneau's stories that get up out of the book and start walking around. But maybe at one point the storyteller imagined that this was possible. And you can think about this in relationship to the muse thaumaturgia, right? All right, so everyone knows the muse thaumaturgia, right? So thaumaturgia was the ancient Greek muse of working miracles and magic in a sense, but magic not in the sense that we have today of where we recognize like the magician on stage is performing a deception and we enjoy the deception, just like the children listening to the mom's fairy tale. They enjoy it. They know it's not true, and in fact they probably believe that it's less true than it actually is, because they haven't reached the point of the anagnoresis yet where they realize that mom was really talking about herself. And she was telling a story about this young woman, that was abused by her stepsisters. She was saved by this magical helper, that could turn pumpkins into carriages, and mice into horses, and all this stuff. But they didn't realize that mom was really talking about herself and her day at work. And the miracle, was that she could survive, at all and provide for these children in an economic environment that was hostile to her. Because maybe the reason that she didn't have a better paying job is because she was a woman and nobody had enacted the Equal Rights Amendment, right? Equal Rights Amendment hadn't passed, and her opportunities were limited. And maybe she was a woman of color. Maybe she was an African American woman, and she couldn't get a job that really paid enough to support the needs of her children. And so that's why she had to work this overtime, and that's why it was so difficult for her to tell these stories, because she was tired. And maybe the representation of these these unfair stepsisters was a representation of the larger unfairness in the society in which she lived. And this would occur to the children perhaps unconsciously or years later. But maybe there was a time, and it was the time, in which this muse, thaumaturgia, really dominated, really dominated, took control, and maybe thaumaturgia in this ancient time, or we can imagine a time or a possibility of such a time in which thaumaturgia, claimed to be the mother of all the muses. And all stories and all tellings, belong to thaumaturgia. And thaumaturgia was the miracle worker, because a seed that was planted in the real world that she took into the fiction, that grew into a tree and that bore fruit, she could return to the real world. That was her thing. She could find a tree in the real world, take its seed, turn it into a fiction, grow a tree, and then return whatever the fruit that was the result of all this work that she put into the storytelling. She could return it to the world. So this was how it worked. So Erratum and polyhymnia, we can see how these muses have a relationship to thaumaturgia, right? The miracle worker. Thaumaturgia was the muse, and if you wanted it to rain, you recited the incantation for rain. And because, thaumaturgia was your muse, it rained. And that was the positive aspect of thaumaturgia, right? And she could heal the sick. You know the right stories to heal the sick. There's a story about a well and sitting beside a well, and you could tell this story, and it would make people who couldn't walk. It would make them, Olympic sprinters, and you could rescue the crops. And of course, if you had this muse, thaumaturgy, you were really quite valuable to the society. And sometimes people refer to these folks, that interact with this muse as shamans or healers or miracle workers or saints or whatnot. But insofar as they crafted objects, they made aesthetic objects, and these objects perform the work of the world, and they were performative, right? In J.L. Austin's sense of performativity, as sort of real magic, so that if you had the muse thaumaturgia, thaumaturgia. David doesn't fumble over this word thaumaturgia. He knows the Greek better than I do. I have to recall it from memory. I don't have that woman that was providing us the pronunciation algorithmically yesterday. I should have solicited her opinion on the proper pronunciation of thaumaturgia, but I didn't. It's too late. Let's go back to David. So you can see how thaumaturgia was very valuable muse to have at this time, but people forgot her. It was probably in that move in which Memne took over and claimed motherhood over all the muses. The muses are the daughters of memory, and then anybody in the line of thaumaturgia, forgot who they were. But in any case, this magical border crossing moment, somehow got lost, and then it was harder to make rain. If you wanted to make rain or save the crops or perform any other sorts of, and those were the positive things. But you could also do negative things, right? Like you could cast curses, or you could cause someone you didn't like to slip down the stairs, or you could if someone was under the spell of Eros, but the object of affection was under didn't receive the reciprocal calling. You could enlist thaumaturgia to cast a love spell, right? And so the relationship between this kind of seduction and the madness of amour, right? And the sacred, that belongs to polyhymnia, was part of the performativity that belonged to thaumaturgia. And in that sense, thaumaturgia was not really an illusion, because what thaumaturgia did was it bridged the worlds between the impossible and the possible, or the unlikely and the possible. And in bridging worlds, right, it took what we imagine to be these ontological separations between the real and the fictive, and it almost did the opposite of an illusion, right? It brought them together. So that moment in Apollinaire, from Alcool, where he talks about the dead, rising from their graves and returning to the realm of the living, or any of these other border crossings, like the one that Orpheus makes into the realm of the dead to retrieve Eurydice, right? They're all examples of thaumaturgia, if we take them as real, if we take them as part of the fabric of a material reality, that works in such a manner. But if we take that Apollinaire poem as being an example of suspended disbelief, then we have to return to a different idea of illusion, right? And that idea isn't necessarily, an idea that belongs to the Pseudologoi as the daughters of Eris, but maybe something more like the way that mother is telling her story. Because what I want to suggest here is that, what's left out in Hyginus and what's left out in Aesop, even though I like the Aesop, I like what he does with the little boy in the audience. I think that's very useful and it's pedagogically motivated, and that kind of didacticism in a way is something that I perform in my own work, he says. But maybe there's something that got left out in Hyginus and Aesop, and certainly got left out in Hesiod. And I want to propose here that, maybe there was a separate set of daughters. And I'm not sure exactly what their name was, or maybe they had the same name, but they were a different set of daughters. And that would be interesting, because there would be confusion. Just like there's confusion if one Mary is different from another Mary. In the telling of the Christian gospel, you have all these Marys. Well, what if there was a confusion? What if there was a confusion of all these Marys, and we weren't sure which Mary we were talking about? Or what if we wrote a story and every character in the story was named Mary? You can see how this would give rise to problems, but it's possible. It's possible both in a real world scenario and as a device in a fiction. And a lot of Shakespeare's fictions, are motivated by this kind of device, right? This kind of comedy of errors in which everyone's named Mary. And I thought you were talking about that Mary. No, I was talking about the other Mary. Well, this changed my whole relationship to all the actions that I performed, because I thought you were talking about this Mary, and now you're talking about this other Mary. So, it's possible to imagine that there were a whole other set of muses that belong to a different way, a different practice of deception, an entirely different practice than Hesiod is talking about when he reveals that the Pseudologoi are the daughters of Eris. And I want to suggest that there was another set of daughters. There was another set of muses of deception, and they had nothing to do with Eris, or they may have had something to do with Eris, but they weren't primarily related to Eris as her daughters. They were perhaps the daughters of Paizo, right? Of play, of game, of cunning and trickery and deception, but as play, as like the games that children play. Or the game that mother was playing when we developed these stories for them to make them comfortable so that they could have a good night's sleep. And there's a certain kind of way in which deception in language is a form of play, right? So what if we say that maybe not that set of Pseudologoi, but maybe another set, were the daughters of Paizo, of play, of game, of fun, of suspended disbelief, right? And there's a notion that's emerged recently, he says, of aesthetic illusion and the importance of aesthetic illusion, not only in storytelling, but across all domains. And the way that we engage subjectively with a story is we imagine ourselves there. We can place ourselves there. We become, in a certain way, a part of the narratological structure in which the story unfolds. And we identify. Maybe we identify with the character of Oedipus, or maybe we identify with the character of Cathiacar, or maybe we identify with the character of Pyrrhip, or Philip, or whatever his name is in Great Expectations. Or maybe we identify with David Antin, narrating this discourse. He refers to himself here. It becomes like a little metapoetic moment in the commentary. And so suspended disbelief is, you could say, it's a kind of implicit contract between the narrator and the audience that he's narrating to, that plays on all the possibilities of recognition of truth and untruth as a form of game playing, right? And this muse, what are we going to call it? Well, Eris already stole the Pseudologoi, but let's just call it. Let's not worry about the Greek and call it the muse of playful deception, right? The muse of playful deception. So who's bound, by the muse of playful deception? Well, one of the ways that we can be playfully deceptive. Think about a visual artist like Marcel Duchamp, right? And we talked about Marcel Duchamp's relationship to the muse of transgression. But the muse of transgression has the ancient muse of transgression, and the way that the muse of transgression gets played out in Rimbaud, or a figure like Alfred Jarry, is somewhat different from the way that it gets played out in Marcel Duchamp, right? Because that notion of the sacred that's there in the stepping out and in the transgression that Rimbaud makes, he wants to become a madman. But why? Because the madman is always holy, and in a certain sense, that's there in the Jarry too, in a darker kind of way. But Alfred Jarry is like a dark shaman. He's like a dark shaman. He's not just not a saint, he's the opposite of a saint. But in being the opposite of a saint, he shares a lot of the same characteristics, at least regarding the relationship between transgression and the thaumaturgia, like the making it really happen in the real world, right? Like this unleashing of these forces that are hidden in the unconscious and that are invisible, but bringing them into the real world. And you see that in Nerval, and some of the others. But by the time you get to Duchamp, he's more like an illusionist. He's more like a magician on the stage. Now, the difference between a magician and a thaumaturgist is that, the thaumaturgist, really creates the miracles and really makes it rain. And the magician depends upon your understanding that it's an illusion. It's like, think about Marcel Duchamp and his relationship to all of these apparatuses, right? Of the illusion of motion, right? Okay, so what's going on in this time? Well, you have all these motion machines, right? You have the bicycle that moves. Well, it really moves you. It's a mechanical device that really moves you in space and time. But you have these devices of early cinema that are emerging, that create, the illusion of a world unfolding in front of you. But it's not real. It's a representation that was recorded from a moment in the past. Or produced as a mechanical device to create, an illusion of shadows, that even though they're being created in the moment in which we exist, through the use of these simple machines and candles and silhouettes, cut out in these circular rotating machines, create illusions of these figures of whatever they might be, witches dancing across the child's room, right? So this fantasia of motion that's created out of these moving machines. Well, it's an illusion. But it depends upon the idea that we understand that it's an illusion. Now there's a story. There's a story of early cinema, and the train, right? The train arriving at the station. And there's a story about the initial audience response. Of Lumiere's train arriving in the station, and how when this train arrives on the screen as it's represented in cinema, the audience members caught their breath and moved out of the way because they imagined that that this was in fact an act of thaumaturgia, right, rather than illusion. And that story, it has an interesting psychological impact, and perhaps it's true in a certain sense, but it's true in the certain way that if one jumps out from a place in hiding and says boo, that you can startle a child or a peer or a friend or someone else or a stranger, but as soon as they realize the deception and illusion, and the illusion, right, the illusion somewhat vanishes, and there's a laugh or a snicker, and one returns to reality, right? So that the persistence of being caught by surprise in the moment of the illusion is part of the apparatus, more of a magic trick than it is of thaumaturgia, right? Like no one presumably ran out of the cinema and then for decades continued to insist in spite of all of the evidence in front of their eyes that these trains magically emerged in this space that they saw this film, the train arriving at the station, right? No, rather that there was a moment of surprise and then a moment of disillusionment. The anagnoresis that yes, in fact, this was an illusion, this was a magic trick, right? And it caught me by surprise. We didn't realize this was going to happen. We never seen anything like it before. We have good reason to be surprised. Fine, but and then there's Maxim Gorky's account, right? How does it go? I can't recall. David recalls it better than I do in recounting his recollection of this moment in this text by Gorky's, in which he says, "Last night I was in the kingdom of shadows. If only you knew how strange it was to have been there." And then he says why it was strange. And one of the reasons that it was strange was because there were all of these things of the real world, but they had no color, and they were mere fleeting shadows. And he goes on and he describes his experience of the cinema. But his experience of the cinema obviously and clearly depends upon his understanding that it's an illusion. In the same way that the magic trick, in order to fully appreciate the magic trick, you have to understand that it's an illusion. The illusionist is the illusionist, not the thaumaturgist, right? And Duchamp's interest in all of these devices, of early cinema and illusion, and his interest in trompe l'oeil, and even the way that his ready-mades and the construction of his objects often play on misrecognition of the distinction between a two-dimensional service and a three-dimensional object in the world, and how he places, for example, both the nude descending the staircase into motion, and that poor sad young man on a train into motion as a nude, perhaps, maybe, and then creates all of these ambiguities around them in a way, like all of these multiple facets of duck rabbits that create these indecidabilities that belong to this domain of the illusionist, right? So what do we call it? The muse of playful illusion, the muse of playful deception and illusion. It is very much a part of what Duchamp does, and this again is something that distinguishes him from Cage, who isn't particularly, at least as I understand him, David says, interested in this kind of illusion. He's interested more in like I said, his muse is arche. He's interested more in the perception of the world and the meditative possibilities that these perceptions give rise to than he is in creating these illusions. And not only is he not particularly interested in transgression, but he's not interested in transgression and illusion and the combinations of transgression and illusion that might be given rise to, right? And in confluence with one another, like Duchamp. So let's come back, to Kathy Acker. So how does this muse of deceptively, playful illusion, how does this muse, inform the work of Kathy Acker? And it seems to me that it does so on multiple levels, right? That there's a way in which, just like that mother, who takes these fables and these stories, bless you, and the bless you is me in this diegetic space, not blessing Fiber who's sneezing, not David, and not recounting a blessing that David makes and provides the audience in his examination of the varieties of narratological illusion. So, one of the ways, in which she's doing this is she's providing, through the use of collage, right, in a certain way with these materials that she makes, she's creating what appears to be a coherent story, right? And it doesn't matter how many pieces, that she puts into it. This illusion of coherence, right, is maintained through craft and cunning, and in this way, she's much more like that story that Aesop tells, that involves dolos and the construction of the pseudologia, then she is a parent, giving birth, to this form, like, somehow organically, right? Because it's very much constructed, but it's constructed toward a sort of illusion of coherence, and that's what I want to do in the last part of this performance, which we're not quite getting close to yet, because this is only, he says, David reminds us that this is only the seventh part, and that we have, because he knows somehow that this piece is going to be divided into 16 elements, 16 sections, he says. But in the final and 16 sections, I'm going to tell a story, or maybe I'll tell it, before that, section. Maybe I'll tell it at section 14 or 13, and then I'll, do some kind of an epilogue. He says, I'm not sure how I'm going to organize it. I'm not exactly sure because none of this is rehearsed. This is, all just improvisatory, but somewhere around 13, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, I'm going to tell, a concluding story. And I'm going to draw it from, the materials of, commercials. And I'm going to create this illusion that I'm telling a story about my life. And in that sense, I'm going to operate under the aegis, under the sign, under the protection, under the wing of this muse, whatever her name might be, who is the daughter of Paizo, of play, and who represents, either we want to call her, Mary by any other name as the Pseudologoi, or someone else, or one of the Pseudologoi. Do they even have names? What if the names of all of the Pseudologoi were Mary? What would that be like? But he says, and what I want to do is create an illusion in the same way that Kathy Acker created an illusion. Created an illusion of her life, and the illusion of this relationship that she had with Herbert Marcuse, but also an illusion, that belongs to the craft of the fiction as object, right? As object and performance of the deployment of these, found materials, like Charles Dickens. And Pyrrhus, desperately tripping over his own name, trying to save Philip. And how in the piecing together, of these disparate elements, from all these disparate domains. Like I got this one from Walmart. I picked this one up from the Museum of Modern Art. I got this one from William Burroughs. I picked this out of Semiotext. This one belongs to Charles Dickens. Here's a little bit of Pasolini, or here's something from the 1001 Nights or the Arabian Nights. Here's something from Aristophanes, maybe. Here's a tarantula I had when I was a child. I've taken it out of the terrarium and I put it next to the Charles Dickens. And I'm going to perform all of this, as if it were a completely coherent story. And the illusion depends on recognizing, as I said before, the aesthetic value, right? The pleasure that's derived from it, both the pleasure that's derived from it and the aesthetic impact, that we place ourselves there. We place ourselves within the story, full well knowing that the story is a fiction and accepting, right? The contract of suspended disbelief. The contract of the suspended disbelief. So I was walking on the road to Thebes, and I encountered this guy who said his name was Herbert Marcuse. He was in this chariot. Told me to get out of the way. And I said, why? And he responded, isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious? Because I'm the symbolic value of repressive sublimation. And you're the symbolic value of transgression. And transgression is no longer possible in the rhetorical domain of my theory of repressive sublimation. And then Kathy has to respond. It's like, well, have you ever heard of the Sphinx? And to play all of this out, there's a certain amount of suspended disbelief that we have to engage, right? And And then David says, and again, that's what I'm going to perform. Well, Fiverr is, busy. This is back to our diegetic, reality. Fiverr is busy crying away and needs to go outside. And I haven't looked at how long this is so far, but I imagine that it's over an hour. So let's call this the end of talk for the day. Okay, 5. I'm right on at 5.